The first time I understood that silence could make a person invisible was the day I sat in a meeting where everyone praised a system I had built, while not a single person in the room knew my name. Not one. They congratulated directors, department leads, even a project coordinator whose main skill seemed to be forwarding emails with unnecessary exclamation marks. Meanwhile, I sat behind a muted camera icon with my coffee growing cold beside me, listening to people describe my work like it had magically appeared out of thin air. And honestly, I preferred it that way. My name is Evelyn Hart. I'm 32 years old, and for almost 3 years I worked as an external systems architect for a financial technology company called NorthPass Solutions. Officially, I was listed under a third-party vendor agreement, buried so deep in accounting records that half the company didn't even know I existed. Unofficially, I was responsible for the core compliance framework that kept their entire platform operational. NorthPass sold automation software to regional banks. Their product monitored financial risk, tracked operational integrity, and automatically generated audit reports for institutions too lazy or understaffed to do it themselves. The company loved using words like innovation and optimization in investor meetings. What they really sold was trust. And trust is fragile. That's why my job mattered. I built the infrastructure that verified every critical action inside the system. Every permission change, every data override, every suspicious discrepancy. I designed it so the platform could monitor itself like a nervous system checking for pain. If someone tampered with the wrong thing, the system reacted. Quietly at first, then loudly. The only executive who truly understood this was Daniel Mercer, the company's CFO. Daniel wasn't flashy. He didn't post motivational garbage on LinkedIn or speak in TED Talk soundbites. He wore the same dark blue suits every week, drank terrible office coffee, and talked like a man permanently exhausted by other people's incompetence, which meant we got along perfectly. He hired me after a consulting disaster at his previous company nearly triggered a federal audit. During our first conversation, he said something I never forgot. Good systems don't rely on trust, he told me. They survive people. That sentence alone convinced me to sign the contract. For nearly 3 years we worked in near total sync. He protected my autonomy. I protected the system. Simple. I worked remotely from my apartment in Seattle, usually in oversized sweaters with old jazz playlists humming softly in the background. My cat, Miso, spent most days sleeping beside my keyboard like a furry paperweight with anger issues. I didn't attend office parties, didn't join team-building retreats, didn't smile through forced networking calls where executives pretended to care about cross-functional synergy. I just built things, and I built them well. NorthPass passed every external audit during my time there. Their banking partners trusted them because the system almost never failed. What nobody understood was that the platform worked because it had boundaries, invisible ones. I embedded verification protocols into the architecture itself. Every major operational process carried attribution markers linked to credential chains. If someone removed a key authority without proper transition procedures, the system flagged it automatically. Not as sabotage, as protection. Daniel approved every layer of it. Build me a system that panics when idiots touch it, he joked once during a late-night call. So I did. Then Daniel disappeared. No dramatic announcement. No farewell meeting. Just a short email from his assistant saying he'd be taking immediate medical leave for an unspecified period of time. That was it. One day he was reviewing compliance reports with me at midnight. The next day he was gone. At first, I assumed he had prepared someone internally to handle oversight while he recovered. Daniel was meticulous. The kind of man who color-coded backup plans for his backup plans. But 3 days later I got an invitation to a company-wide restructuring call, led by someone named Ryan Calloway, Vice President of Strategic Operations. I'd heard the name before, mostly from engineers who said it with the same tone people use when discussing mold infestations. Ryan was corporate ambition in human form. Expensive haircut, perfect teeth, aggressively polished voice. The kind of man who used phrases like maximizing operational transparency while firing half a department through Zoom. During the restructuring call, he smiled constantly. Not warm smiles, performance smiles. The kind politicians use when cameras are pointed at them. We're entering a new phase of organizational clarity, he announced confidently. Efficiency requires visibility. I muted the call and laughed into my coffee. Because in corporate language, visibility always means the same thing. Someone important wants to start cutting people. Within a week, Ryan had reorganized entire departments. Slack channels vanished overnight. Managers were reassigned. Teams merged together under vague titles no one understood. Everyone suddenly had to submit weekly productivity summaries filled with charts and performance metrics. Engineers who spent 12-hour days maintaining critical infrastructure were now wasting time making PowerPoint slides explaining why their jobs mattered. And Ryan loved it. You could tell. People like him confused control with leadership. Meanwhile, I remained invisible. Technically, I wasn't employed by NorthPass directly. My contract sat inside an external vendor framework Daniel had specifically designed to bypass internal bureaucracy. Ryan didn't even know who I was. At least not initially. The first time he referenced me publicly, he called me the compliance contractor resource. Resource? Like I was office furniture. One of the developers messaged me afterward. He has no idea you built half the platform, she wrote. I replied with a thumbs-up emoji and went back to work. But I started documenting everything more carefully after that. Every system modification, every authorization request, every access change. Experience teaches you patterns. And I recognized this one immediately. Ryan was cleaning house. The warning arrived 2 weeks later. An email. One sentence. Your external access permissions are currently under executive review. No greeting. No signature. No explanation. I stared at the screen for several seconds before leaning back slowly in my chair. There it was. The beginning. Most people panic when corporate language turns cold. I don't. Because corporations rarely surprise me anymore. They follow instincts like frightened animals. When leadership changes, invisible people become liabilities. Especially the invisible people who understand how everything actually works. I opened my internal logs instead of replying. My architecture map filled the screen. Thousands of interlocking processes, verification chains, security dependencies, audit structures. At the center of all of it sat one critical credential layer tied directly to my authorization markers. Not because I wanted power, because Daniel insisted on accountability. If someone removes the architect, he once said, the system should know. So it did. Ryan just didn't know that yet. Over the next few days, the atmosphere inside NorthPass shifted noticeably. Developers sounded nervous during calls. Managers spoke carefully. Even executives started using overly formal language in emails, which is always a terrible sign. Then came the calendar invite. Subject line. Scope clarification meeting. Friday, 8:30 a.m. Hosted by Ryan Calloway. I almost declined it. Instead, I accepted without comment. Friday morning arrived gray and rainy. Seattle weather always seemed to understand mood better than people did. At 8:28 a.m., I joined the call. Ryan appeared immediately on camera from one of those glass executive offices designed to look impressive while offering absolutely no privacy. He smiled the moment he saw me. Too confident. Too rehearsed. Evelyn, he said smoothly, like he had practiced saying my name beforehand. Thanks for making time. I nodded once. No small talk. No pleasantries. He folded his hands together dramatically. I'll keep this straightforward, he began. We've conducted a review of several external operational contracts, including yours. There was a pause there. A performance pause. People like Ryan love pauses because they think silence makes them sound powerful. Unfortunately, he continued, there appears to be significant ambiguity surrounding your role within the company infrastructure. Ambiguity. Interesting word choice considering I had built the infrastructure. You've contributed valuable support, he added carefully. But NorthPass is moving toward a more internally aligned operational model. Translation. We think we can replace you cheaply. I stayed silent. That unsettled him slightly. You could always tell when men like Ryan expected emotional reactions and didn't get them. So effective immediately, he said. Your contract with NorthPass Solutions is terminated. There it was. Clean. Simple. Predictable. He slid a document toward the camera like some kind of cinematic reveal. You'll also need to delete any proprietary company material currently stored on your personal devices. All intellectual property remains with NorthPass. I looked at him calmly. Can you send that instruction in writing? I asked. His smile widened slightly. Of course. He emailed the document immediately. Already signed. Already prepared. Meaning the decision had been finalized before the meeting even started. I opened the attachment and read carefully. Terminate external access. Delete all locally stored company systems and documentation. Permanently remove proprietary architecture materials. Signed, Ryan Calloway, VP Strategic Operations. I saved the file. Then I looked back at the screen. Understood, I said quietly. No arguing. No pleading. No emotional speech. That confused him more than anger would have. Because people like Ryan measure importance through resistance. They assume silence means weakness. Sometimes silence is just patience. The meeting ended 2 minutes later. By 9:15 a.m. I sat alone in my apartment staring at the system I had spent nearly 3 years building. Miso jumped onto the desk and curled beside my arm. Outside, rain tapped softly against the windows. I opened the local repositories one by one. Source files, architecture diagrams, testing environments, development frameworks. Then I began deleting everything. Exactly like Ryan instructed. Every folder disappeared permanently. No hidden backups. No secret copies. No revenge fantasies. Just deletion. But Ryan had misunderstood something fundamental. The real system was never stored on my laptop. The important parts already lived inside NorthPass. Embedded deeply. Verification logic. Credential anchors. Audit dependencies. The platform knew who built it. And more importantly, it knew when critical architecture disappeared incorrectly. At 11:42 a.m., the first automated integrity alert triggered inside NorthPass. At 12:16 p.m., their banking compliance portal registered an unresolved credential disruption. At 1:03 p.m., NorthPass received an official inquiry from their primary lending partner requesting immediate verification of operational continuity. And somewhere inside a glass executive office, Ryan Calloway was probably still smiling, not realizing the system had already started screaming. Ryan noticed the problem at exactly 1:27 p.m. Not because he understood the system, because finance suddenly stopped answering his messages with cheerful corporate politeness. One of the engineers later told me the entire executive floor changed atmosphere in under 10 minutes. Conversations got quieter. Slack channels slowed down. Meetings ended early without explanation. That's how panic enters companies like NorthPass. Not loudly. Silently. Like smoke sliding under a locked door. At 1:31 p.m., an internal compliance alert flagged an unresolved authentication inconsistency tied to a credential authority removal event. Mine. The system wasn't crashing. That would have been dramatic. Instead, it was doing something much worse. Questioning itself. And when banking software starts questioning its own integrity, everyone suddenly remembers regulations exist. Apparently, Ryan spent the next hour walking between departments asking increasingly irritated questions while pretending not to be worried. What exactly did she work on? Why are the banks involved? Can someone explain what this credential issue actually means? Nobody had good answers. Because nobody besides Daniel and me fully understood how deeply the architecture was integrated into NorthPass's compliance structure. I learned all of this through private messages from engineers who still had access to internal channels. One of them sent me a screenshot from an executive Slack thread. Urgent. Pending verification request from Crest National Bank regarding operational credential integrity. Another message appeared underneath it seconds later. Can someone clarify who authorized removal of external compliance architect access? Then silence. Beautiful silence. I sat in my apartment eating leftover noodles straight from the container while watching the company slowly realize they had unplugged something important. Still, I wasn't celebrating. People always assume situations like this feel satisfying. They don't. Mostly they feel inevitable. At 2:04 p.m., my phone buzzed. Daniel Mercer. For a second I simply stared at the screen. Then I answered. His voice sounded rough, exhausted. Like someone running on medication and caffeine. Did he instruct you to delete local architecture files? He asked immediately. No greeting. No small talk. Classic Daniel. Yes, I replied calmly. In writing. Yes. A long pause followed. I could hear papers shifting somewhere on his end. Then, send it to me. That was all. I forwarded the signed memo without another word. 3 minutes later I received a read receipt. 7 minutes after that, North Pass's internal legal department requested emergency access to historical compliance documentation. Things were accelerating fast now. Around 3 p.m. Crest National Bank formally suspended North Pass's operational credit extension pending investigation into what they described as potential procedural integrity violations. That single sentence probably shaved 5 years off multiple executives' lives. North Pass relied heavily on that credit line to maintain liquidity during quarterly expansion cycles. Losing access, even temporarily, was catastrophic. And all because one executive wanted to impress people with a restructuring plan. The irony almost made me laugh. By evening, Ryan's confidence had reportedly started cracking around the edges. One engineer described him as aggressively sweating. Another said he spent 20 straight minutes arguing with IT because he couldn't understand why the compliance alerts wouldn't clear manually. Because they weren't bugs. They were safeguards. The architecture was doing exactly what it was designed to do. Daniel understood that immediately. Ryan apparently did not. At 6:40 p.m., Daniel returned to the office. He wasn't even supposed to be back from medical leave for another 3 weeks. But crisis has a way of dragging competent people out of recovery. According to one accountant who witnessed his arrival, Daniel walked into headquarters looking pale enough to qualify as legally deceased. Still terrifying though, especially quiet people. Quiet people are dangerous when angry because by the time they speak, they already know exactly where to cut. The first thing Daniel requested was the credential audit history. The second thing was Ryan. By now nearly everyone in leadership understood something serious had happened. Legal teams don't schedule emergency evening meetings unless money is actively bleeding somewhere. Ryan entered the conference room at 7:12 p.m. carrying a laptop and what remained of his confidence. Daniel sat at the far end of the table reviewing printed documents. Not yelling. Not pacing. That somehow made everything worse. One of the legal analysts later described the room as feeling like standing beside train tracks. Daniel looked up once Ryan sat down. Did you authorize Evelyn Hart's termination? He asked calmly. Ryan adjusted his tie. Yes, after reviewing organizational. Daniel interrupted him immediately. Did you authorize deletion of locally stored architectural materials tied to active compliance systems? Ryan hesitated. Yes, but did you verify transition protocols before issuing that instruction? Silence. Ryan blinked. Well, I assumed. You assumed. Daniel's voice stayed perfectly level. That's what made it frightening. I believe the system ownership had already been internally distributed, Ryan said carefully. Based on what documentation? Daniel asked. Another silence. Longer this time. Ryan looked toward legal for support. Nobody moved. Daniel slid the printed memo across the table slowly. Ryan visibly recognized it. All local systems must be permanently deleted, Daniel read aloud. Your wording. Ryan swallowed. I was following standard offboarding practices. No, Daniel replied softly. You were improvising. That sentence apparently hit harder than shouting would have. Because it was true. Ryan hadn't understood the system well enough to touch it safely. And now everyone in the room knew it. Daniel opened another document. System authentication structure. Credential dependency chains. Operational compliance anchors. My name appeared repeatedly throughout the architecture maps. Not as ownership. As verification authority. The distinction mattered enormously. You removed an active credential validator from a live compliance environment without transition approval, Daniel said. Ryan frowned slightly. She was an external contractor. Daniel leaned back slowly. She was the architect. That ended the conversation. Not officially, but emotionally. From that point onward, the room apparently shifted against Ryan completely. Legal stopped treating him like an executive and started treating him like a liability. Because that's what corporations really fear. Not incompetence. Risk. By midnight, internal investigations were already underway. IT security teams began reconstructing access logs. Compliance officers reviewed every change Ryan had authorized since Daniel's leave began. Human resources suddenly discovered a passionate interest in procedural correctness. Funny how that happens. Meanwhile, I sat at home wearing sweatpants, listening to rain hit the windows while Miso attacked a cardboard box like it had personally insulted him. My laptop remained closed. I hadn't touched the system since the deletion. Didn't need to. The architecture was documenting everything itself. That was the entire point. At 9:13 the next morning, Daniel emailed me directly. Subject line: Need temporary assistance. Inside was a single sentence. The bank requires validation from the original architect. I read it twice. Original architect. Strange phrase. Strange how quickly people remember your importance once consequences appear. I replied 15 minutes later. What scope? Daniel responded almost immediately with temporary restoration credentials and a list of verification requests from Crest National Bank. No emotional commentary. No apology. Just work. Again, classic Daniel. I logged into the environment carefully. The system greeted me exactly as expected. Integrity warnings. Escalation markers. Credential mismatch chains. The architecture hadn't failed. It had protected itself. I reviewed the damage logs one by one. Ryan's deletion directive had triggered authentication instability across several interconnected audit pathways. Nothing irreparable, but enough to force mandatory external review procedures. Which was precisely what those protections were designed to do. The bank needed assurance that no unauthorized tampering had occurred. So I gave them the truth. I compiled a clean technical report explaining the sequence of events in painfully simple language. Unauthorized credential removal. No transition authorization. Integrity escalation correctly triggered. System functioning as designed. That final sentence mattered most. Because it shifted the narrative completely. This wasn't a malfunction. It was proof the safeguards worked. At 11:47 a.m., Crest National acknowledged receipt of the report. At 12:02 p.m., NorthPass Legal placed Ryan under formal internal review. At 12:30 p.m., his Slack account went inactive. People noticed immediately. Corporate silence spreads faster than gossip. Nobody announced anything publicly, but employees started whispering. Some claimed Ryan had resigned. Others thought federal regulators were involved. One ridiculous rumor suggested someone intentionally sabotaged the company from inside. That one almost made me choke on my coffee. Because the funniest part of all this was painfully simple. Nobody sabotaged NorthPass. Ryan did exactly what he wanted to do. He just never understood the consequences. Late that afternoon, Daniel finally called me again. This time his voice sounded more tired than angry. I should have prepared documentation before leaving, he admitted quietly. It surprised me hearing him say that. Daniel rarely admitted mistakes aloud. You assumed people would follow procedures, I replied. A dry laugh escaped him. Apparently that was optimistic. For several seconds neither of us spoke. Then he asked, "Are you willing to assist temporarily while we stabilize everything?" Interesting wording again. Not come back. Not return. Assist. As if both of us already understood something important. Nothing would ever go back to normal after this. I looked around my apartment. Rain. Coffee cups. Cat fur. Silence. Peace. Then I thought about NorthPass headquarters filled with executives scrambling through legal damage control, because one arrogant man mistook understanding for authority. Finally I answered. Temporary only. Daniel exhaled slowly. That's fair. But even then, sitting safely inside my quiet apartment, I had a strange feeling the worst part still hadn't happened yet. Because people like Ryan rarely collapse gracefully. And desperate executives are dangerous when they realize their careers are bleeding out in real time. Ryan tried to save himself on Wednesday. Of course he did. Men like him never believe consequences are permanent until the door locks behind them. By then, NorthPass had become a very strange place internally. Nobody trusted anyone. Meetings disappeared from calendars without explanation. Managers suddenly use phrases like document preservation and legal sensitivity in conversations that used to be about software releases. Even the engineers sounded different. Careful. Like people whispering inside a hospital waiting room. Ryan's office remained occupied, but barely. His assistant stopped sitting outside the door. His calendar access got restricted. Half the executive team suddenly became unavailable whenever he requested meetings. Corporate abandonment is fascinating to watch. One day you're important. The next day people act like standing too close to you might become evidence. I only knew fragments at first. Then around noon, one of the senior developers called me privately. "You won't believe this," he said immediately. "Try me." "He's blaming you." I laughed before I could stop myself. Not loudly. Just once. Sharp and tired. "How?" "He's saying the system was intentionally designed to create dependency vulnerabilities." Now that made me sit up straighter. Because those words mattered. Dependency vulnerabilities implied malicious intent. And malicious intent changes everything legally. What exactly did he say? I asked carefully. The developer hesitated. He told legal the architecture shouldn't have been tied to individual credential validation. He said you created operational leverage intentionally. Operational leverage? God. Corporate people really do think changing vocabulary changes reality. The system wasn't dependent on me personally. It was dependent on authorized oversight. There's a difference. A massive one. And Ryan knew it. He just needed a villain badly enough to pretend otherwise. That afternoon Daniel sent me a heavily redacted copy of Ryan's formal statement. Reading it felt like watching someone build a raft out of wet cardboard. Ryan claimed he had been misled regarding the scope of architectural authority, delegated to external contractors. He claimed critical infrastructure dependencies were insufficiently disclosed. He claimed the compliance escalation event was an unreasonable systems response. That part almost impressed me. Imagine triggering an emergency brake and then arguing the train overreacted. But the worst part came near the end. He implied I had deliberately designed the architecture to preserve personal relevance within the company. That one lingered in my head longer than I expected. Not because it hurt. Because it revealed something deeply pathetic about him. Ryan genuinely could not imagine someone building safeguards without selfish motives. To him everything was power, visibility, leverage, influence. He couldn't comprehend the possibility that some people simply care whether systems survive incompetence. Daniel called an hour later. "He's trying to shift intent," he said immediately. "I noticed." "He won't succeed." I leaned back in my chair. "You sound very certain." "Because I have documentation." That got my attention. Daniel almost never sounded confident unless he already held ammunition. "What kind of documentation?" Silence. Papers moving. Then, the March architecture approval meeting. I remembered it instantly. Quarterly compliance review. 2-hour executive session. Horrible coffee. Ryan had attended briefly near the end. Back then he was still trying desperately to insert himself into upper leadership discussions. Daniel continued. The credential escalation structure was explained during that meeting. I frowned. He signed off on it? Yes. That single word changed everything. Because now Ryan's defense wasn't incompetence. It was negligence. And negligence is harder to spin. Apparently legal discovered the archived approval records that morning. Digital signatures. Meeting transcripts. Infrastructure summaries. All preserved. Ryan had approved the exact safeguards he now claimed were hidden from him. I actually felt embarrassed for him then. Imagine trying to rewrite reality while corporate servers quietly store receipts forever. By Thursday morning, the atmosphere inside North Pass had apparently become unbearable. Developers avoided executive floors entirely. Finance teams were preparing contingency reports in case the bank investigation expanded further. Human resources started interviewing employees who had interacted with Ryan during the restructuring process. Nothing says, your career is ending quite like HR suddenly wanting detailed timelines. And still somehow Ryan kept fighting. That afternoon he requested a direct meeting with Daniel. Private. No legal observers. Daniel agreed. Later he told me exactly how it went. Ryan entered the office trying to project confidence, but according to Daniel, he looked exhausted. Tie crooked. Eyes bloodshot. The kind of face people get when sleep stops working properly. I think this situation is being exaggerated. Ryan began carefully. Daniel just looked at him. No response. Ryan continued anyway. The system architecture clearly lacked organizational transparency. Still nothing. Finally, Ryan leaned forward. With all due respect, Daniel, one contractor should not have enough influence to destabilize operational relationships with our banking partners. That's when Daniel finally spoke. She didn't destabilize anything. Ryan blinked. Daniel's voice stayed calm. You removed a load-bearing structure because you thought it was decorative. Apparently that sentence hit the room like a brick. Ryan tried again. I made the best decision possible based on available information. No, Daniel replied quietly. You made a decision before understanding the information. Then came the part one enjoyed most. Daniel opened a folder and placed several documents on the desk. Signed architecture approvals, compliance acknowledgements, infrastructure dependency reviews. Ryan's own signature appeared repeatedly. You approved every safeguard you're now criticizing, Daniel said. For the first time since this entire disaster began, Ryan apparently stopped talking completely. Daniel told me later the silence lasted nearly 20 seconds. 20 seconds is a very long time when your career is collapsing. Finally, Ryan said something almost desperate. I was trying to streamline operations. And there it was. The truth. Not strategy. Not governance. Not organizational optimization. Ego. He wanted visible results fast enough to impress people above him. So he cut into systems he didn't understand. Because confidence is easy when consequences haven't arrived yet. Daniel ended the meeting shortly afterward. By evening, rumors spread that Ryan had retained private legal counsel. Always a bad sign. Meanwhile, I continued assisting temporarily with restoration verification. The actual technical damage was manageable. Most issues involved regulatory trust pathways, rather than broken infrastructure. But trust takes longer to repair than software. Crest National Bank remained cautious. Every report had to be reviewed twice. Every authorization required additional verification. NorthPass was bleeding credibility by the hour. Late Thursday night, I stayed awake longer than usual reviewing system logs. The apartment was dark except for monitor light and soft rain reflecting against the windows. Miso slept beside the keyboard, twitching occasionally in dreams. I stared at the architecture maps for a long time. 3 years of work. Thousands of decisions. And somehow all of it had become tangled inside one executive's need to feel important. That part bothered me more than the termination itself. Not the arrogance. The carelessness. Ryan never asked questions because he assumed understanding was beneath him. That's the real danger in people like that. They think authority replaces competence. Around 1:14 a.m., my secure inbox received a message from someone inside NorthPass Legal. Anonymous. Only one sentence. He's trying to claim you acted independently without authorization. I read it twice slowly, then closed the laptop, because suddenly the situation felt different. Less corporate. More personal. Ryan wasn't just trying to survive anymore. He was trying to bury responsibility under someone else. And if there's one thing I've learned after years inside corporate systems, it's this. Desperate people become reckless. Friday morning proved that theory immediately. Daniel called before 8 a.m. They found something, he said. His voice sounded strange. Not angry. Disappointed. What kind of something? Another pause. Then, Ryan attempted to access restricted compliance archives last night. That made my stomach tighten slightly. Unauthorized archive access during an active legal review is catastrophic for executives. What was he looking for? We think he was trying to alter documentation trails. I sat perfectly still, because that crossed a line. Corporate stupidity is common. Tampering with compliance evidence during a banking investigation is career suicide. Possibly actual legal suicide. Daniel continued carefully. Security caught the access attempt automatically. Nothing was changed. Of course it was caught. The system logged everything. That was the whole point. And suddenly I understood something very clearly. Ryan still believed this was fixable through image management. He thought the problem was narrative, optics, documentation. He still didn't understand the real issue. The system itself had already recorded the truth. Every action, every authorization, every timestamp. Machines are merciless that way. They don't care about charisma. By noon, Ryan's executive access was formally suspended. At 2:17 p.m., his company email stopped functioning. At 3:04 p.m., someone packed personal belongings from his office into 2 cardboard boxes. One of the engineers described watching it happen from across the floor. "No one even looked at him," she messaged me later. "That part hit harder than I expected. Not because I felt sorry for him, because indifference is colder than hatred. And after everything he'd done, the company had already emotionally erased him." Still, the story wasn't over yet, because Ryan had one final mistake left to make. And this one would destroy him completely. Ryan came back Monday morning pretending nothing had happened. That was his final mistake. Most people, when they realize the building is burning, try to escape quietly. Ryan walked back inside carrying a coffee. One of the receptionists later told me he smiled at her like usual. Same polished executive smile. Same expensive coat. Same Bluetooth headset hanging around his neck, like he still expected important phone calls. Nobody smiled back. By then, everyone inside North Pass knew. Not the full story, but enough. People stopped conversations when he walked near them. Managers avoided eye contact. Even the elevators felt awkward around him. Corporate exile happens before official termination. Human sense collapse instinctively. Ryan still thought he could manage perception. That's the part I'll never forget. He genuinely believed confidence could overpower evidence. At 8:42 a.m., Daniel arrived. At 8:47, legal entered the executive floor. At 8:51, Ryan was called into conference room C. No windows. Neutral gray walls. The kind of room designed specifically for uncomfortable conversations. Daniel was already inside waiting alongside Angela from legal and 2 representatives from Crest National Bank attending remotely through video conference. Ryan sat down slowly. Nobody offered coffee. Nobody made small talk. Angela placed a printed document in front of him. "We need clarification regarding unauthorized archive access conducted Friday evening using your credentials," she said calmly. Ryan's expression shifted almost invisibly. Tiny movements tell the truth long before words do. "I don't know what you mean," he replied carefully. "Bad opening move." Angela rotated the document toward him. "Security logs. Time-stamped. Authenticated. Painfully detailed." Ryan stared at the page without touching it. Daniel spoke next. "Why were you attempting to access restricted compliance records during an active investigation?" Silence. Then Ryan tried the only strategy he had left. Deflection. "I was trying to understand the full scope of architectural failures." Angela didn't blink. "You attempted to access sealed documentation tied to legal review procedures." "I had executive authorization." "No," Daniel interrupted quietly. "You had executive title." That sentence landed like concrete. Ryan leaned forward slightly, frustration finally bleeding through the polished corporate mask. "This entire situation has become absurd," he snapped. "One contractor created a system so fragile that removing her caused operational paralysis. There it was again. Fragile. As if safeguards were weaknesses instead of protections." Daniel looked at him for a long moment before answering. "The system wasn't fragile." His voice stayed perfectly calm. "You were careless." The room went silent. One of the bank representatives finally spoke through the conference monitor. "Mr. Calloway," the woman said evenly, "our concern is no longer the architecture." Ryan turned toward the screen. "It isn't." "No," she replied. "Our concern is leadership conduct surrounding protected compliance infrastructure." That was the moment everything ended. You could almost feel it. The exact second Ryan realized this wasn't internal politics anymore. Banks don't care about office power games. Regulators don't care about executive charisma. They care about procedure, documentation, risk. And Ryan had violated all 3. Angela opened another folder. "This includes your deletion directive. she said calmly. Your attempted archive access, your failure to follow credential transition protocol, and your false claims regarding undocumented architecture dependencies. Ryan looked genuinely pale now. You're making this sound intentional. Daniel answered immediately. No. Intentional would almost be better. Ryan frowned. Daniel leaned back slowly. You didn't understand the system well enough to touch it safely. That's the problem. Nobody spoke after that, because there wasn't really anything left to say. At 9:26 a.m., Ryan Calloway's employment with NorthPass Solutions was officially terminated. Security escorted him out through the underground parking entrance to avoid attention from the main office floor. Ironically, almost nobody would have watched anyway. People had already moved on emotionally. That's the cruel thing about corporations. No matter how important someone thinks they are, the building keeps breathing after they leave. By lunchtime, his company profiles disappeared completely. Slack deactivated. Email disabled. Executive bio removed from the website. It was like watching someone erase digitally in real time. One engineer joked that NorthPass deleted Ryan faster than he tried deleting me. I laughed harder than I probably should have. Still, despite everything, the aftermath felt strangely quiet. No celebration. No dramatic victory. Just exhaustion. Over the next several weeks, NorthPass worked desperately to stabilize relationships with Crest National Bank and other partners. Daniel remained buried in meetings almost non-stop. Legal teams reviewed every restructuring decision Ryan had made during his short reign over operations. The findings were ugly. Unauthorized budget shifts. Improper vendor reviews. Missing approval documentation. Nothing criminal. Just reckless. The kind of reckless that grows when confidence outruns competence. As for me, I continued assisting temporarily while transition teams rebuilt proper oversight procedures around the architecture. This time with documentation so excessive it bordered on comedy. Daniel insisted on it. If someone ever tries this again, he told me during one late-night call, I want future investigators drowning in paperwork. Reasonable request, honestly. Around a month later, Crest National officially restored NorthPass's suspended credit authorization. That email alone probably saved the company millions. Daniel forwarded me the notice with a single line underneath. System survived, people. I smiled when I read that, because years earlier, that sentence was exactly why I agreed to work with him in the first place. 3 months after Ryan's termination, Daniel offered me a permanent executive position at NorthPass. Chief Systems Integrity Officer. Massive salary. Equity package. Full authority over compliance architecture. I declined. Not because I was angry. Not because I wanted revenge. I was simply tired. Tired of corporate ambition. Tired of executives treating infrastructure like branding. Tired of explaining that invisible things are usually the ones holding buildings upright. Instead, I accepted a much smaller consulting role with limited hours and absolute autonomy. Remote only. No management responsibilities. No executive meetings unless legally necessary. Daniel agreed immediately. I think he understood. A few weeks later, I cleaned my apartment properly for the first time in months. Opened the windows. Threw away old coffee cups. Organized paperwork. Miso supervised aggressively from the couch like an unemployed dictator. Rain drifted softly outside again. Seattle always circles back to rain eventually. That afternoon I found Ryan's original termination memo buried in an archive folder on my desktop. The same document that started everything. All local systems must be permanently deleted. Signed confidently at the bottom like authority itself could rewrite reality. I stared at it for a while before finally moving it into permanent storage. Not out of bitterness. As a reminder. Because the truth is, most disasters don't begin with evil people. They begin with arrogant people. People who think understanding is optional. People who mistake visibility for value. People who walk into complicated systems believing confidence automatically makes them competent. Ryan thought he was removing unnecessary weight from the company. What he actually removed was the one person quietly preventing the entire structure from collapsing under human stupidity. And the funniest part? The system worked exactly as intended. It noticed the damage. It recorded the truth. And in the end, it survived the people who tried to control it. Just like Daniel said it should.